Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, then please pop along to patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 30, Episode 10, Artemisia of Halicarnassus.
This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand, living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast.
In his account of Xerxes' invasion of Greece, the historian Herodotus goes out of his way to give an account of Artemisia, female tyrant of Halicarnassus, before, during, and in the aftermath of the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. This account and Artemisia herself are remarkable for a variety of reasons, but the idea of a woman commander, one as clever as a man, had a great impact on the ancient world. Of course, one of the reasons for Artemisia's prominence in Herodotus's histories is that she came from Herodotus's own hometown of Halicarnassus. We might therefore expect Herodotus to paint her in the best light possible. It needs to be pointed out, however, that this Artemisia was the mother or grandmother of the tyrant Lygdamis, who, according to one biographical tradition, was the enemy of Herodotus's family in Halicarnassus. The scant biographical detail we have on the historian's life, which is not contained in his histories themselves, however, rests on very little authority and so may not be that useful. Regardless of this complication, Herodotus's picture of Artemisia is resoundingly positive. Even at her first mention, Artemisia is singled out for special attention. I pass over all the other officers because there is no need for me to mention them, except for Artemisia, because I find it particularly remarkable that a woman should have taken part in the expedition against Greece. Herodotus goes on to give us the details that Artemisia was the daughter of Lygdamis of Halicarnassus and of Cretan extraction on her mother's side, that her husband had died and that she had assumed his tyranny of the city. And despite the fact that she had a grown son, she accompanied Xerxes' expedition not out of compulsion or necessity, but out of manly courage. Artemisia commanded a contingent of men from Halicarnassus, Kos, Nisira, and Calydna, with 5 ships. These were reputed to be the best ships in the fleet, save those from Sidon, commanded by King Tetremnestus. Despite the fact that Artemisia only provided 5 ships out of the 1,207 total, she gets more coverage in Herodotus than any Persian commander, with the exception of Mardonius, King Xerxes' cousin, brother-in-law, and senior commander. When we meet Artemisia, she had already served with distinction at the Battle of Artemisium. I did not play a negligible or cowardly role in the sea battles of Euboea. In the 5 passages where she is mentioned, Herodotus gives a remarkable portrait of Artemisia, which provides ample material for historians to ponder. Artemisia is also singled out by Herodotus as giving her king the best advice. Of course, her function in Herodotus's story is to provide the correct advice to Xerxes, which would necessarily be ignored. This is a well-known topos in Herodotus, where a hubristic ruler, in this case the Persian king, casts aside sound advice only to come to regret that decision later. This context of the wisest advisor is indeed where we next meet Artemisia. Xerxes assembled his commanders before the Battle of Salamis and had Mardonius ask them if he should offer battle. All agreed that battle should be offered except for Artemisia, who advised the king, via Mardonius, to spare his ships, since he had already punished Athens, the purpose of the expedition. She further advised that the alliance of Greek city-states would dissolve quickly, especially if Xerxes marched into the Peloponnese, and because the island of Salamis had no provisions. She ended her advice by making a jibe against the bad slaves of the kings from Egypt, Cyprus, Pamphylia, and Cilicia, in whom there is no usefulness. These last three states were Korea's rivals on the southern coast of Anatolia. Artemisia's unusual presence as a female commander and advisor in Xerxes' retinue is not directly remarked upon by Herodotus, despite the fact that the male role she had assumed was in itself remarkable and something other later writers would make much of. Greek audiences, especially those in Athens, would have been well aware of how out of place Artemisia was in such a context. After this advice, Artemisia's friends despaired that she had doomed herself in the eyes of the king, while her enemies, presumably including those from Cyprus, Pamphylia, and Cilicia, revelled in her anticipated downfall. Herodotus, however, states that Xerxes was pleased with her advice, but decided on offering battle along with a majority opinion. He intended that they would fight better when under his watchful eye. According to Herodotus, Artemisia had been informed that there was no food on the island of Salamis, and so it is possible she had spies amongst the Greeks. Burns considers that there is no reason to doubt the story of this conference, and that it was probably from Halicarnassian sources and represents Herodotus's first scoop of the war. Artemisia's fame rests not on this advice, though, remarkable though her presence at Xerxes' council was, not to mention the bravery of the advice itself going against all the other male advisers. It is her conduct at the Battle of Salamis itself which assured her fame. Herodotus tells us, Artemisia's behaviour caused her to rise even higher in the king's estimation. It so happened that, in the midst of the general confusion of the Persian fleet, Artemisia's ship was being chased by one from Attica. She found it impossible to escape because the way ahead was blocked by friendly ships, and hostile ships were particularly close to hers, so she decided upon a plan which did in fact do her a lot of good. With the attack ship close astern, she bore down on and rammed one of the ships from her own side, which was crewed by men of Calinda, and had on board Damasithemus, the king of Calinda. She found that by ramming it and sinking it, she created for herself a double piece of good fortune. In the first place, when the captain of the Attic ship saw her ramming an enemy vessel, he assumed that Artemisia's ship was either Greek or was a defector from the Persians fighting on his side, so he changed course to attack other ships. As Xerxes was watching the battle, he noticed her ship ramming another vessel, and one of his entourage said, "Master, can you see how well Artemisia is fighting? Look, she has sunk an enemy ship." They could recognize the insignia on her ship, and therefore assumed that the ship she had destroyed was one of the enemy's, an assumption that was never refuted. No one from Calinda's ship survived. Xerxes said, "My men have turned to women, and my women into men." Firstly, it is worth noting the confusion of battle which this anecdote provides. Allies ramming one another, pursuers being misled by such actions, insignia being unrecognised by the chasing Attic ship, but recognised by the king's entourage much further away, although at the same time they did not recognise the Calindan insignia. Some have questioned the details of this story, and indeed we do not have to accept every detail of it at face value, but the episode does have verisimilitude, depicting wonderfully the confusion in the middle of a sea battle. It has been conjectured that Damasithemus may have stood in Artemisia's way dynastically. Herodotus suggests they may have fallen out, and certainly Calinda was close enough to Halicarnassus, since both were in Caria, to be considered a rival, and not to be confused with the Calydni, the islands northwest of Kos, and under the command of Halicarnassus. The episode seems, however, a far more pragmatic and expedient act undertaken in the heat of battle, rather than a premeditated attack on a local rival, although we might expect such a version if Herodotus's source was a Halicarnassan. Artemisia's Odysseus-like expediency in saving herself at Salamis became an episode of great notoriety. In Book 8 of his Strategemata, written in approximately 162 AD, Paulinus of Macedon includes 50 stratagems of women from 46 individuals or groups. There were originally more, since the manuscript breaks off mid-stratagem at 8.71. The only individual woman who receives more than one stratagem, however, is Artemisia. Her actions are there further amplified. We are told that she struck her Persian colours in order not to be recognised by the ship she rammed or her pursuer. This would seem to be a rationalisation of the fact that the pursuing ship did not recognise her insignia in Herodotus. This idea is taken further in another anecdote claiming that she had both barbarian insignia and Greek insignia on board. Paulinus then records that after Salamis, Xerxes sent Artemisia a panoply of Greek armour as a prize for valour, but to the commander of the fleet he sent a spindle for spinning wool, amplifying the men into women, women into men message, even though these prizes are not in Herodotus's account. The assigning of Artemisia a role as a clever commander is in itself significant, as it shows a tradition of Artemisia being considered a commander of note as late as the 2nd century AD. It is worth noting that Plutarch did not include Artemisia in his Bravery of Women, written in the period prior to Paulinus's work. Nonetheless, this tradition of Artemisia as a commander was important even when she has possibly been accompanied with Artemisia II from the mid-4th century. Tradition passed it down under our Artemisia because she was the clever commander. There are additional anecdotes concerning Artemisia in Aulus Gellius, Valerius Maximus, and Photius. Artemisia's most famous action could even be used by Aristophanes in the Lysistrata, performed in 411 BC. She is used as a warning against giving women any ground at all. If any man among us gives these women even the tiniest handhold, there's no limit to what their nimble hands will do, while they'll even be building frigates and launching naval attacks, cruising against us like Artemisia. Aristophanes used Artemisia elsewhere too. At the close of the Thesmophoriatsusi, written in the same year as the Lysistrata, Aristophanes has Euripides use Artemisia's trick as a device against the archer, a weapon instantly associated with Persia, even though in the play it is against a Scythian. Artemisia next offered advice to the king following the defeat at Salamis, Herodotus tells us, this time concerning whether Xerxes should stay in Greece and advance on the Peloponnese, or depart and leave an army in Greece under Mardonius. Artemisia was especially welcome to give advice, since, given what had occurred at Salamis, only she was perceived to have offered the correct advice previously. When she arrived for the council, Xerxes met with her both in person and privately. This is in itself a sign of the utmost trust Xerxes now had extended to her, This time she advised, "I think that you should pull back and leave Mardonius here with the troops he is asking for, since he is offering to do that of his own free will. My thinking is that if he succeeds in the conquests he says he has set himself, and things go as he intends, the achievement is yours, master, because it was your slaves who did it. But if things go wrong for Mardonius, it will be no great disaster as regards your survival and the prosperity of your house. But if anything happens to Mardonius, it doesn't really matter. Besides, if the Greeks win, it won't be an important victory, because they will only have destroyed one of your slaves. The whole point of this campaign of yours was to burn Athens to the ground. You've done that, so now you can leave." Herodotus here is offering a perspective of the wars, which is remarkably modern. The non-Greek or Western-centric perspective of the Persian wars is usually regarded as a 20th century idea, but it conforms to the perspective Herodotus gives to Artemisia here, perhaps showing an awareness of the still looming presence of Persia in Greek politics and life in the 440s, when Herodotus was presenting his material around Greece. We can contrast this perspective with that presented in Aeschylus's tragedy Percy, also delivered from the Persian perspective and first performed in 472 BC, which paints Salamis as a disaster like no other and one that predicted the defeat of the Persians at Plataea. Xerxes was delighted with Artemisia's advice to leave Greece, since it aligned with his own intentions. Herodotus essentially accuses Xerxes of cowardice, saying he was so frightened that he would not have stayed even if everyone had advised he do so. Nonetheless, Artemisia was honoured with the task of escorting Xerxes' children, who had accompanied him on the campaign back to Ephesus. It is interesting to note that the prize for valour and the gift of a Greek panoply recorded by Paulinus do not occur at any point in Herodotus and must come from another historical tradition or an account which has left little other trace. Another indication of an alternative tradition or alternative traditions and an incident it is unbelievable that Herodotus would not have included if he knew of it, comes from Plutarch, Themistocles 14, where Artemisia recognised the body of Ariamenes, Xerxes' brother and admiral of the fleet, floating in the sea, and carried the body back to Xerxes. This story is not incompatible with Herodotus' account, although probably from a source he did not use, but the anecdote recorded in Paulinus, where the admiral was sent a spindle, cannot be from the same tradition, where the admiral was dead in the water. Herodotus' high praise of Artemisia can also be subtle. He states that included among the men who won the most renown during the Battle of Salamis was Arminius of Pallene, the captain who had pursued Artemisia. He states, if he had realized that Artemisia was on board, he would not have stopped until he had either captured her or been captured himself, not just because all the Athenian captains had orders to that effect, but also because a reward of 10,000 drachmas had been offered for capturing her alive, since the Athenians were furious that a woman was attacking their city. By this last comment, Herodotus equates Artemisia with the Amazons who had besieged Athens in the mythological past. See Plutarch, Thesis 27. It is interesting to note that during the battle sequence itself, Herodotus only mentions that Artemisia was pursued by a ship from Attica and that hostile ships were particularly close to hers. His amplification of that account, to include more detail later, provides an insight into his techniques as a writer. He did not include the details of Arminius earlier because the focus of that story was Artemisia herself, and the details provided later would have taken the focus off her. The 10,000 drachma reward is only mentioned in the later passage as well. Thus, in the earlier passage, we have only that an Attic ship pursued her and that other hostile ships were close by, without an explanation that the reason for that was, perhaps, orders to capture her and the price on her head. This would be especially true if she flew recognisable colours. Herodotus's account states she did, but the tradition recorded in Paulinus later may confuse the situation by maintaining that she struck her colours or that she flew alternative ones. The complex interplay of themes within the idea of a woman in a man's world of military command, and, what is more, of a woman behaving in a more manly way than the men, reveals a whole series of themes in Herodotus. Firstly, as Herodotus's references to the reward and comparison with the Amazons show, the idea of a woman in a man's world in an Athenian context was unthinkable and in fact quite threatening. Aristophanes was able to make use of these same ideas in both the Lysistrata and the Thesmophoriaptuse. At the same time, however, the wisest and most manly of the Persian commanders at Salamis was, of course, a female Dorian Greek from Halicarnassus. It is almost as if Herodotus is saying, should it be any surprise that Artemisia was the most manly Persian? More than that, Artemisia was, of course, from Herodotus's own home city. This whole idea ties into the pervading Greek equation of Persian masculinity as being feminine, and by extension Greek femininity as being more manly than Persian masculinity. Artemisia had shown herself both as a capable advisor and commander, and remarkably in doing so transcended the usual ideas of gender roles. This was both admirable and frightening to a Greek male audience. Artemisia's example has echoed down the ages. We should remember that Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the most accomplished Italian painters of the 17th century, was given that name for a reason. Well, thanks again for writing that script for us, and if you would like to write a script for us, then drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that, as it is for any of your questions or suggestions. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of me and Angus for staying with us throughout this 30th season of the History Network, and we will be back in the autumn with season 31. Thank you so much again to all our patrons who do make this podcast possible. If you would like to just pop along to patreon.com/The History Network if you've not yet become a patron, and just have a look at how easy that is to do. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Dahm, read by Nick Barker.